coffee. That's my MO. Okay,
yes.
so let's get started. So it's officially 12 o'clock. So we're going to start the middle school level of the voting rights in America. So let's begin the recording. Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to have you for this week's class on voting rights in America. There's a lot to look at in the Constitution and try to look for voting rights in America and understand the history as well as the modern conversations around it. So today we're here with Nick Mosvick, who's one of our top scholars at the Constitution Center. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the Constitution Center, and we're going to help walk you through this whirlwind tour of the Constitution and voting rights. So we have about a half an hour to go, and we love questions in the Q&A or the chat box. But before we get started, Nick, would you like to do an introduction of yourself?
Oh, let's just keep it quick, so keep moving. I'm Nick Mosvick, and I am one of our senior fellows in constitutional content at the National Constitution Center, and I have a PhD in American history and a law degree, so I am a constitutional historian.
And I like to call him, he's our twofer. We get 2 degrees, 2 major degrees out of Nick.
Tom will eventually be that. Our other fellow will also join me in the twofer. Twofer.
I love it. I get 2 for 1 with my constitutional scholars.
Right.
Here's some big questions we have around voting. So number one, what does the Constitution say about voting rights? This is one of the hottest topics in America today. And we know our students are talking about it. They hear their parents and their adults talking about it. And teachers are talking about it as well. So my question always goes back to who can vote in America? And I know that depends on who, when, why, and all that framing kind of information around it. But if you can help us unpack the Constitution and then unpack the history of voting in America, then we can look at the conversation today around voting in America. And then just a couple other big things that we really want to know about is how did the end of the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments totally change the Constitution and voting rights in America? And then what are some of the big amendments that we should really know about, like the 15th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 27th Amendments? So there's a lot going on here, right, Nick? So do you want to introduce some big idea about voting? And I'll give you a beautiful background slide of Harry Truman to help you.
Yeah, so I think we want to start where we always start in these conversations, which is with the Constitution text itself, because a lot of those questions that you asked, I think, can be collapsed into one broader question, which is what the Constitution's text says and doesn't say about voting, which is to say the very first thing we can start with is there's nothing in the Constitution that specifically protects a right to vote. And that remains true. We'll get to the amendments.
Can you say that one more time? Because it's a big one. Yes. So I want you to say it one more time.
There is no specific general right to vote in the Constitution's text. There was not one from the beginning. And although it's been considered in other amendments, there is still not one within the amended Constitution. So Kerry just put up this slide here. That gives you a lot, right, that we're going to talk about. We have a lot of amendment to get to. That's one theme there is a lot of amendments to the Constitution have been related to voting, which suggests something about the fight over voting rights over the course of American history, right? So something about its predominance in our discourse. But we start with the Constitution's text again, right? And Article 1 is a really natural place to go because that tells you something about, as I started with, what the Constitution says and doesn't say. And this goes back to our conversation we recently had too about federalism, right? So here in Article 1, we see that division between what powers the states maintain and retain and what new powers are given to Congress. So Article 1, Section 2, that sets qualifications for voters in the United States. House elections are based on the proportion of the population, right? This is the more democratic provision in that sense, right? Since it requires states to elect national representatives with the same rules that apply to the most democratic component of each state government or its lower house. And Article 1, Section 2 also leaves the election of senators to state legislators. Now, we'll get to the amendment, the 17th Amendment, which changes that, but this means for the first 125 years of American history, senators were elected not directly, but through state legislators. And again, that goes to the federalism, right? That voting and federalism are very much tied together, and they are in the original text of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 4, this leaves the time, place, and manner of elections to state legislators. It's subject to regulation by Congress, but this is significant, right? Again, we're talking about federalism, and this provision here says that essentially that states get to make the very basic rules for voting, right? And that's significant because that's still true, right? Generally, we're still talking about what states can and cannot do, but states have a lot of power as to prescribing the normal rules for things like the questions Kerry brought up right at the beginning, like when can you vote? Well, states generally decide that. And when we talk about modern cases, we'll be talking about the same thing. The last thing to note, of course, is that Article 2, Section 1 sets up the Electoral College. Now, we've spent a fair amount of time talking about the Electoral College, so I think we can move past that, but it's just noting one more time that that's another place within the Constitution's original text that voting is referred to.
So I'll add that in, even though I was like, we could skip it for now. But there's a lot in there. And so it's so funny when I look at this list, and I know we're going to walk through all the amendments, and we think of that statement is like, voting isn't guaranteed by the Constitution, but like you said, there's a lot of moments in the Constitution that reference and talk about voting. And I think it's really interesting for our students to remember time, place, manner, because those three words, I think you'll hear a lot from us depending on what part of the Constitution we're talking about. But time, place, manner of who gets to vote, when can they vote, and how can they vote was left up to the states. So that gets into some of the other conversations when we look at who gets to vote and who's added in through amendments into making sure that they have the right to vote. Time, place, manner plays a part in that conversation. So it's connected to that base Constitution or the original Constitution and the amendments as well. So before we go into this 12th, 14th, I think you guys probably know some of these amendments. So I thought we'd play a really quick, fun poll game and launch our first poll. Let me make sure I pick the right one. This is Guess the Amendment poll. So I'm going to launch it for you right now. If you can't see the poll, don't worry about it. I will ask the questions out loud, and you can use the chat box to answer. So first question is, this amendment is ratified in 1870 and says that the right to vote cannot be denied by race. It bans racial discrimination in voting. Which amendment is it? And I have to be honest, I kind of gave you trick answers. So think this one through. Is it the 13th Amendment or the 15th Amendment? Okay, good job in the chat box answering it in there as well. Smart. Second question. The second question is, this amendment grants women the right to vote and is passed in 1920. Which amendment is it? Is it the 17th Amendment or is it the 19th Amendment? That's question number 2. Which is the amendment that grants women the right to vote, cannot be denied upon sex, 17th or 19th Amendment? And then the third and final question, and then Nick is going to walk us through and give us answers. This amendment is ratified in 1965, and it ends poll taxes in national elections. Which amendment is it? Is it the 24th Amendment or the 26th? That was a hard one. I know that one was a really hard one. I'll give everybody a minute to answer. Let you go through, and then we're going to make Nick give us the tutorial on this. So nice job in the chat box. I'm really proud of you guys of answering in there as well. But we'll start with the first one. I'm going to let people keep answering, and you can change their answers or vote twice because this is not a presidential election. Sure, you can vote as many times as it will let you. So first question, Nick. This amendment is ratified in 1870. And says that the right to vote cannot be denied by race. It bans racial discrimination in voting. Is it the 13th Amendment or the 15th Amendment? So 3 or 15? Which one?
That's the 15th Amendment.
So the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment does not allow discrimination based on race. What is the 13th Amendment? Just so we can make sure we know what that is.
Previous condition of servitude, which is important because that language is also derived from the 13th Amendment, which of course prominently bans slavery. and it has other language, which is I just suggested, which is somewhat important, but that's what it does, yes. And they both have clauses that allow for enforcement. So that will always worth noting that there's an enforcement clause in both of those.
So these are the Reconstruction Amendments that we talked about in the beginning. These are at the end of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment is the first one of the Reconstruction, 3 amendments, and it ends slavery. And the 15th Amendment that says you cannot deny vote based on race or previous condition of servitude. Did I say that correctly?
Race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's the text.
Perfect. The triple threat. Awesome. So the answer to that one is 15. Next question. This amendment grants women the right to vote, and it was passed in 1920. So which amendment allows women the right to vote, Nick?
And I kind of already answered this because I told you what the 17th Amendment was, and so it's the 19th Amendment. So
awesome. So different. 17th Amendment is direct election of senators by the people, and the 19th Amendment allows women the right to vote. And it's 1920. I put dates on there to give you hints too. And then the last one, and this is the hard one, this amendment is ratified in 1965, and it ends poll taxes in national elections. Which amendment is it? Is it the 24th Amendment or the 26th Amendment? 24th or 26th? So Nick, tell us what the 24th is first, and then go to the 26th, and we'll go one by one.
Yeah, so that's the 24th Amendment, which I feel threw in there, right? And it's hard because there's actually several amendments that are passed right in that period, because the 23rd Amendment comes just a couple years before that. We'll talk about that because that's important here. That's DC getting electoral votes. That's basically have some in that. 26th Amendment, that's only passed, I believe, 6 years later. So during the Vietnam War, which allows 18-year-olds to vote. But really, the language is important again because it's imported from those earlier amendments, which is to say there's no age discrimination allowed in voting for those adult citizens over the age of 18, right?
We might need to hold on to that for a hypothetical later, right?
That's why I'm saying it.
Say it one more time. The 26th Amendment says you can be 18 to vote, but there is no
discrimination on the basis of age for those citizens who are over the age of 18.
So far with the 15th Amendment, you can't be discriminated based on race. 19th Amendment on sex, and 26, if you're over 18, you can't be discriminated based on age. So given our big buckets here, and then like you said, a lot of these amendments have, especially the Reconstruction, have enforcement. So that means they're giving Congress power to make sure this happens. And the question is always, did they use it, or did they use it at the right time? So we're getting into that next. Let's do a jump back. We're going to end the poll. Nice job, gang. That was a really good job. And we're going to jump back to this really quickly because I think we've done a very good constitutional walk and bang through most of these in a fun way. You're doing a poll instead. But Nick, do you want to just do one beat on the 14th Amendment because it's such an awesome amendment that we don't want to not give it its due time?
Should we do a beat on the founding a little bit more? Do we want to do any of that?
Sure.
Period?
I think that sounds great. I think we start with that. I think that's a great idea. Let's jump back to the founding story. We'll go back in the Wayback Machine to the 1776 to the 1790s. Go for it.
Yes, so this is important because one thing I like to talk about in these classes is to remind students that one of the most important, if not the most important issue before the Constitutional Convention 1787 was representation. And the reason I say that is not only because of the reality of how important this was, but looking at the term itself, right? So we talk about voting, but in the 18th century, the dispute was really over representation, which could mean voting, but it could mean a lot of things, right? It meant how you, the individual citizen, were being represented by your government or not, right? And what representative government looked like. And there were different theories, including the parliamentary theory from the British system, and then the ones that Madison and others brought into the Constitutional Convention. And we've talked about this in other classes. people would look at it now is the degree to which democracy was going to be more direct or more representative in the broader sense. Think of Madison and Federalist 10, the idea of representation as a mirror of society, right? The best representatives, but not necessarily direct, right? All of this is just to restate to say that representation, that is the big question. And therefore, that's a way for us to understand why they're worried less specifically about the right to vote itself, which they leave to the states generally, and more worried about how representation looks like and is divided within the new federal government, right? And that's when we've talked about Article 1, for instance, and the Senate and the House, and the differences between them, how the presidency is constructed. All those things we've been talking about for really the past 2 months help us to explain too the mindset by which they would have constructed this Constitution. Of course, the other thing that is important, every time we talk about the 18th century, we talk about state constitutions because they are important, right? And in this case, we see a general trend and then we see exceptions, right? The general trend is that state constitutions limit the right to vote to male white property owners. The exception is that that's not true in all states, right? Vermont's a little bit different on those property owning requirements. They make it easier for people without property to vote. Pennsylvania is a little bit different in that regard too, because they have a pretty democratic constitution in 1776, or at least they experiment with one. Women can vote in New Jersey. They can from 1776 to 1807. And in a lot of northern states, free Black males can vote, right? They have citizenship and they are also able to vote as well. So there's a general trend, but then there's a lot of exceptions, which is to say there's kind of a lot going on, a lot of different competing systems going on in this moment in time, right? And the Constitutional Convention really doesn't change that, right? They essentially accept that experimentation at the state level and don't do anything to really mess with it, right? We'll talk in a second about the 19th century, how that changes, because the natural question is, okay, so, but how do women and Blacks lose the vote in some sense, right? How does that happen? And so I think we've already talked about the text, right? And I think that gives us at least a good sense of what they were dealing with. What changes is that there are two different poles, right? I mean, we could use gravity, we could use a different metaphor to think about this, right? But there's one pole towards greater voting rights, but that's specifically universal white male suffrage, which grows in the 1820s, really. And we call this the Jacksonian period. I sometimes like to think about it as the Van Buren period, because it's really Martin Van Buren who is the political genius behind the revolution. That's really the generation after the revolutionary generation, this new generation, these new political minds and parties, right? These creation of professional parties. That's Van Buren's big contribution, is the creation of the New York party system and the spoil system that comes with it. And he articulates a vision of broad male suffrage, right?
Nick, what year are we talking about around this time period? So he's
on the rise in 1820, right? We're talking about the 1820s. And so it's Van Buren becomes Jackson's manager, his campaign manager in 1828. Not in 1824. He actually is not Jackson's. He supports Crawford, who becomes incapacitated. That's a different election. But the point is that Van Buren kind of comes up with the system, and he articulates this theory of why this is more democratic, and it will take down aristocracy and the problem of interest, right? Like the bank. Why is the national bank evil? Well, that's already been kind of articulated by Van Buren in this rising new system. And with it is the spread of universal male voting, right? But what comes with it is also a turn against voting, more broad voting in some of these states, right? So New Jersey changes, like I said, in 1807. They get rid of women's right to vote. They had actually given it by law in 1790, but 17 years later, they reversed themselves. Part of the reason seems to be that the parties had theories that the other party benefited too much from the women voting, so therefore they needed to get rid of it. And states start to turn against the black vote. New York is one of them. I think they make that change in 1820. Here in Pennsylvania in 1838 at their constitutional convention, so this is their third constitution already, 1776, 1790, and 1838. What are the two ways they want to restrict the right to vote? Well, they want to restrict it for black men, and they want to restrict it for immigrants. Those are the two, think of them as interests, right? Because you have to articulate this, right? As whose interests are we trying to represent and whose are we limiting? Women vote for the wrong party, okay, we can limit them. Immigrants, the thought is they're gonna vote for the wrong people, right? That they're like one collective interest, and so therefore we can limit them. And the same worry about free blacks, right? Is they'll vote for the wrong people. So let's limit their vote.
So I think this is really fascinating. So in the beginning, people were much more interested in who's representing them. And It's not about direct vote, but representation. So the power struggle in the colonial period and the early American period was, let's make sure we get the best representation and the most representation. And at that time, most states were white male landowners, but there were a few exceptions like New Jersey for women, Vermont that would allow others to vote. But then you get this shift during the 1820s, and white males get more and more privilege and ability to vote, but then other groups go down. And it's really about, and correct me if I get this wrong, but it's really about the parties trying to see where can they shift the power, and also where can they control who's voting for whom. That feels very fascinatingly crazy. And I feel like we don't talk about this enough in America.
And it's shifting all the time, because by the 1850s, like New York City, the immigrant vote, the Catholic vote, as they call it, that creates a whole new party, an opposition to immigrants called the Know Nothing Party. So the dynamics, the shifting dynamics of dealing with the immigrant vote, thought to be the German and the Irish vote, is something that you can understand over several decades, that they're trying to articulate competing visions to deal with this potential vote. But I think that tells you a lot about both the history itself and the political dynamics of the 19th century, which are pretty complex and constantly moving. But also that progress moves in a very, not a linear way, right? It's not always an upwards arrow. The trajectory can kind of, it would be like a sine, right? It's what I'm looking for the word. There's
sine wave, ebb and flow.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a verb for that.
Nick and I talk about this all the time. Like, so many times we think about like creating a more perfect union, and when we all look at our American history, we think like, oh, a lot of people have this tendency to say, it arc, and MLK said it, the arc bends towards justice. But it's really like, if you looked at the graph, and this is where math class is actually really helpful, guys, and you track this over time, you would see a zigzag. You would see kind of like this ebb and flow of voting rights, and you see kind of women having a little bit more power and less, African Americans having a little more power and less. And then you see pushback at when this pullback from women's right to vote, you get people stepping up like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott saying, no, no, no. You get this kind of pushback towards it. So it's not so easy, and it's not so linear. It's not a straight path. It's more of a zigzag, which is why we find the history of different time periods so fascinating, because then you can kind of understand and see that our country's been grappling with this. You think it's just today? You think it's just the last like 10 years? It's not. It's been over time. So Nick, okay, we've got like 6 minutes left, so we're gonna fly through this. So give us 2 seconds on these two ladies and how they kind of kick off the push for the 19th Amendment, and then we're gonna fly through the couple more real quickly.
Yeah, so I mean, I think to me, the important thing to always note about the women's rights movement that emerges from the 1830s and 1840s is that comes out of the abolitionist movement and the reform movement generally, because women find a place to speak publicly and articulate their ideas and to have real force in these reform movements that come. That includes temperance, but that includes the abolitionist movement. And they find real voices in that, and that includes Lucretia Mott, although she's not the only one. And out of these anti-slavery societies, women eventually realize their own condition and the ways in which they could also use similar organizations and arguments to present moral reasons for their own freedom, right? In other words, it kind of becomes an inner conversation as well, right? They're outwardly professing these reasons to get rid of slavery. They realize that these arguments kind of turn inward. And then we have Seneca Falls in 1848. And that's really kind of one of the first public articulations of that argument. I have to say one of the first because there's some good research to suggest that we see some of this earlier, but the point is, what are they asking for? They're asking to be included amongst we the people in the Declaration of Independence. So all men and women are created, or all people are created equal. And they're asking for other legal equality as well, especially in the rights of married women in particular. They don't want women to lose their independence and their property rights when they become married. The 14th Amendment, we can say really quickly, what's important about that is it's the first time male is put into the text of the Constitution. It's in Section 2 of 14th Amendment, which essentially says that states can lose representation in Congress if they discriminate against the black vote, right? But in order to do that, they put male in there, and that really upsets the women's movement, right? They start thinking about their own stronger push for a separate amendment to recognize the women's right to vote.
So, and this is what I think is fascinating, is that you can't take these like amendments separately, and you can't take these moments in history separately. You can't look at voting rights without looking at the end of slavery and the abolitionist movement and how they're all intertwined. So putting the 14th Amendment in there and spelling out citizenship and equality, but then adding the 15th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment says males, so then we need a 19th Amendment to add in females. But real quick, and I know we have like 3 minutes left, so I'm trying to figure out the exact future date to kind of jump us to. We think about these changing amendments. We think about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment that put this idea of citizenship, because if you're a citizen, then you have the right to vote, or you have at least can fight for the right to vote. And then the next part is that 15th Amendment says African-American males cannot be denied, and 19th Amendment says women. But this isn't always, the 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment are put into place in the end of the 1800s. But you don't see major change in African-American men and African-American women being able to vote until 1960s, 1965, 68. Jump us up to kind of fast forward that to Nick. What in that enforcement clause is in, how does that play out over those, over like almost 100 years?
Yeah, so I think a couple things are worth quickly articulating here. I mean, for one, it's worth saying that we talk about Jacksonian democracy, but the fact here is we're also talking about that democratic vision is one that everybody grasps to and wants to be a part of. And that's kind of the story we're articulating over the 19th century, is the way that Black and, of course, Black citizens and women also want to share in that more democratic vision that emerges, that I think is different from the 18th century vision. Those enforcement clauses, as I noted, they're really important, right? They talk a lot about this in the debates in Congress, and the sense that there needs to be some power to enforce these rights, or even a duty upon Congress, right, to recognize these things. This comes from other theories. We don't really have time to talk about them, but they're there. The 15th Amendment, there were different versions written. Some of them had universal language recognizing a general right to vote. Some of them talked about banning poll taxes and other forms of discrimination that some of the framers thought were obviously going to happen. They could foresee the possibility of rampant discrimination in the South as soon as they returned more fully to the Union. So they were very much worried about that. And that was another reason for the enforcement clause. But there were civil rights acts passed, and especially the Civil Rights Act of 1875, that's very important in terms of dealing with public accommodations and some of these cases with private actions, right? So there was strong articulations of that power in the 1870s. What we haven't discussed, we don't have a lot of time to go through, is that the Supreme Court in this period very much limited the meaning of some of those texts, right? We can talk about the civil rights cases. That's in 1883 that strikes down that 1875 Act. We can talk about a series of voting rights cases that deal with the 15th Amendment that very much limit its ability to meaningfully end racial discrimination in voting. That really doesn't start to change until about 1915, which is when the Supreme Court strikes down what's called a grandfather clause. What that meant is, for purposes of these, not the poll taxes, but not the quizzes, the tests that they would give to
literacy tests.
Literacy tests, that's what I'm thinking of. And what they would say is, look, if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. Of course, you can see the logic here is the only people's grandfathers who could vote at the time were white. So it necessarily meant that for especially poor whites who couldn't pass the literacy test, they could still vote. So it was discriminatory in action. That was actually struck down by the Supreme Court, and that's really the first time we start to see some effort at the Supreme Court level. But think 1915, that's still 45 years after. And it really still takes till the 1940s and the striking down of what's called an all-white primary in 1944, where you see a little bit more robust vision. But as Kerry points out, that's 1964 there, Reynolds versus Sims. And that's the real articulation of what people call one person, one vote. That's the principle that we know it is. There's a series of other cases, including Baker versus Carr, which has to do with the ability to sue and constitutionally for the drawing of districts, of voting districts, right? That's something that the Supreme Court can essentially take a case over, which Shaw versus Reno emerges out of as well. So that's the key question there is, okay, what can the Supreme Court review in terms of the drawing of congressional districts and voting districts? That's a really important question, right? And so, but that only starts even with 1962, which overturns an earlier decision actually that said that the court couldn't review them because they were political decisions.
So real quick, give us the 2 seconds, because we have like 1 minute left.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to like buzz through everything. Like,
you can never do everything. So, but I want students to walk away with knowing what the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You know, we know that there's a ton of energy being pushed around this, and there's protests and there's marches and there's, you know, some of the most amazing speeches of American history happen and lead up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And how does this change kind of voting for African-American men and women? So, you know, like I said, almost 100 years after that 15th Amendment said you cannot deny it, how does the Voting Rights Act actually make it happen?
Yeah, so as you said, we don't have very long. So I think the important thing is just to understand that it creates something called pre-clearance. The idea here was that the Voting Rights Act not only used the 15th Amendment's power to enforce, it also used the 14th Amendment's power to enforce. It actually combined the two to suggest that combined there was even greater power, right? Because this was generally an assertion of the civil rights power to enforce. And pre-clearance, the idea there was that, look, in these southern states where they're preventing this vote, and recall this was just after the poll taxes were banned as well, this creates a mechanism to enforce that ban on racial discrimination voting. So states are required, those that have poor voting rights histories, to obtain national permission before altering their voting laws, right? So they have to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws. And so that was based on a history of invidious discrimination. So that's really the heart of that requirement that comes out of there in terms of dealing with the immediate history of racial discrimination in voting and having some success in that period in really altering the ability of Black Americans to vote.
So this is now saying that the federal government is going to check you, states, because if you haven't been behaving well, we have the power in the Constitution to enforce it, and are finally using that 15th Amendment. Now, that there was a part of that that was, I don't want to say rolled back, but what is the right word, like pulled back from a little bit with the Shelby v. Holder case, because I know a lot of teachers are talking about Shelby v. Holder, and I know this is really quick, but part of that talked about pre-clearance. So and there was a lot of dissent on this as well. It was 5-4 decision. Am I getting that right? 5-4?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So give the students real quickly. So this is an ongoing debate in the courts. We're seeing this over time is how do we use the 15th Amendment and what are the rights that and acts that Congress can put forward to make things happen, and where is it too far in this time period? So we're seeing this ebb and flow, and that's why we have so many questions about voting rights, I mean, literally in America.
Yeah, so I think the really quick, easy way to summarize it is that it only strikes down one provision of that 1965 Act. And essentially, the court said, if you're going to continue having the pre-clearance requirement, which you could, in theory, Congress could repass, they have to update the formula for creating it. Their point was you can't just rely on discrimination that existed at that point 48 years ago, at this point 55 years ago, saying is you have to update it so that at least there's proof that these states are still have a history of racism in voting and voting discrimination, and that would be articulated in any changes that they make to the voting rights laws, right? So that was their theory. You can't just operate on the same assumptions anymore because the 15th Amendment requires something greater in terms of proving continued discrimination as the basis for using that enforcement clause. And so that's the rub of the argument too, because the dissents also flow from that same articulation of whether or not Congress can continue to rely on that or if they have to update it.
They have to update it. So this is ongoing. Like, when will they update it? How accurate? And then look at it again. So these rulings sometimes don't just solve something. They say these are the steps that need to be taken next. And so this is why when we talk about voting rights in America, we have to understand where it is and where it's not in the Constitution, and then how different acts and then different amendments kind of change that system over time. One of the questions that I'd like to end with on this was earlier, I think it was Lauren that asked it, how come, so she said, kids are a lot smarter now than they were back in the colonial period. So why don't we make the right to vote start at 16 and not 18? And I love that question. And I know that some areas are allowing 16-year-olds to vote in local elections. So Nick, and I know you can't really answer this, but are there any guidelines around why 18? I mean, I know 18, but why 18 and not 16 today?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, I think the answer is because 18 is and has been traditionally and broadly accepted as a legal standard for adult personhood. And that is why I think, you know, without articulating my own personal views, certainly people would also point to the point in which adults fully form their opinions and are ready to participate, which is the reason for keeping the age higher, right? Is when essentially brains and personalities are formed enough to participate fully in the process.
And I think it's a pretty fascinating question. That is what Mrs. Cunningham's class, one of her students, answered. But I also think it's some of the people who are positive for that and want to push it forward say that if students are the ones that are in school, shouldn't they at least be able to vote on who their school board members are? And I thought, like, well, they're the closest to it. So it's an interesting dynamic back and forth. But voting rights in America, from the larger questions of time, place, manner, to how we can vote, to all those pieces, really does have a changing pattern over time, and really does look at not just what happens at the local level, but the national level, and shows federalism in all its inner workings. So thank you so much for joining us for class. more questions as we go through this week. And if you have any more, you definitely have our email addresses. Shoot us your follow-up questions and Nick and I will get back to you. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
I don't think we have remaining questions.